Welcome viewers, you are about to hear a captivating and chilling tale, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. In this story, a chilling series of deaths, strange laughter echoing through the halls, and a web of deceit will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to subscribe and prepare yourself for a mystery that will leave you questioning everything. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Case of the Laughing Corpse. The fog clung to the streets of London as if reluctant to dissipate, thick and palpable like a veil over the city's slumbering secrets. A pale morning sun, barely cutting through the haze, cast faint light on the cobblestones as Sherlock Holmes stood at the foot of a narrow street, his sharp gaze scanning the surroundings. His silhouette, tall and slender, contrasted against the grey gloom, a figure of stillness and precision amid the bustle of the waking city. The house he had come to investigate loomed before him, a modest townhouse in a quiet corner of the district, but there was something about its unassuming facade that hinted at hidden turmoil. Holmes tilted his head, the tips of his fingers brushing the edge of his chin as he considered the scene before him. There was an odd stillness about the air, as though the entire street was holding its breath. Holmes stepped forward, his boots making soft sounds on the wet pavement, each step measured, deliberate. He was no stranger to the quietude of a mystery, nor to the weight that such stillness often heralded. As he reached the door, a figure appeared in the frame. A woman, mid-age, her features masked by grief and a veil of unspoken words. Mrs. Lavinia Carter, widow of the late Albert Carter, greeted him with a strained smile. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from sorrow or fatigue, Holmes could not tell at first glance. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for coming," she said, her voice a soft tremor that spoke more of desperation than politeness. "I don't know what to make of it. Holmes raised his hand to silence her, his gaze still scanning the area. He was a man of few words when faced with a puzzle. His mind was already sifting through the details, but his eyes continued to assess the environment. The street, the house, the woman before him, all were pieces of the larger enigma. "Allow me a moment to observe," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to her. Mrs. Carter stiffened, but he had already turned his attention to the door, inspecting the frame, the latch, the brass handle. Every detail about the house seemed to echo with muted secrets. Nothing extraordinary, yet everything about it spoke of subtle disturbance. The house, like the woman, was holding something back. Holmes stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under his weight as if even the house was hesitant to welcome him. The interior was just as unremarkable as the exterior, dimly lit with heavy curtains drawn, hiding the light that seemed so reluctant to enter. He paused, breathing in the faint scent of lavender mixed with something more sinister. The air had a heavy, almost stagnant quality, as though it hadn't been disturbed in some time. Holmes's sharp eyes took in the room's layout with the precision of a seasoned detective. His mind, though calm on the outside, was already racing with questions. "Lead me to the scene," he said without turning to Mrs. Carter, his voice cutting through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. She hesitated, eyes flicking nervously toward the staircase. Her lips trembled before she spoke again. "Upstairs. But Mr. Holmes, I must warn you, it's not what you might expect." Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling his readiness. Mrs. Carter took a step forward, her reluctance almost palpable. Holmes followed her closely, though at a deliberate distance, his mind already analyzing the smallest movements in her posture, the way she held herself, as though bracing against something unseen. As they ascended the staircase, the faint sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the low, persistent ticking of a clock somewhere above, a sound that seemed to stretch time itself, each tick adding weight to the mystery pressing down on them. Holmes paused at the landing, eyes narrowing as his ears strained for any sound, any clue to what lay ahead. The house, though eerily quiet, seemed to throb with an unseen pulse. Mrs. Carter stopped before a door at the end of the hall. Her hand rested on the brass knob, trembling as she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, I don't understand why he would do this. Why Reginald?" Holmes glanced at her briefly, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment. There was something about her, an undercurrent of guilt or fear, or perhaps both. "Reginald Blythe," Holmes repeated, his voice steady. "You believe the death is connected to him?" Her gaze flickered, but she nodded. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, Reginald was my late husband's cousin, and I think it's connected to something that's been haunting this house for years." She stepped aside, allowing Holmes entry. Holmes's eyes darted toward the door, his mind already at work. He took a deep breath, then entered the room without further hesitation. Inside, the room was darker than the rest of the house, the heavy curtains blocking out the faint light that attempted to creep through the cracks. The floor was covered in dark, worn rugs, and a large four-poster bed dominated the room's center. But it was not the room itself that caught Holmes's attention. It was the body. The man lay sprawled across the floor in an unnatural position, his face frozen in an unsettling expression, a grin that seemed too wide, too grotesque. The man was dressed in fine clothing, though disheveled, as if he had been taken unaware. Reginald Blythe. Holmes crouched beside the body, his trained eyes scanning the scene with eerie calm. His gloved fingers brushed against the deceased's wrist, confirming the obvious: the man was dead. But there was something about the body, the way it was positioned, something that spoke to a story untold. "Tell me everything you know," Holmes said, his voice cold and detached, his gaze still fixed on the body. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Mrs. Carter's voice broke the silence, shaking as she spoke. "I found him this morning. It was the laughter, Mr. Holmes. I heard it last night, echoing through the halls, and when I entered this room, this is what I found." Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood slowly, his eyes flickering over every corner of the room, every detail. The curtains, the furniture, the odd positioning of the body, all of it was part of the puzzle. But one thing, one peculiar detail, caught his attention. A faint, almost imperceptible imprint of another set of footprints near the window. His brow furrowed and he turned back to Mrs. Carter. "Someone else was here last night. You were not the only one to hear the laughter." Mrs. Carter's face paled and she took a step back, her hand pressing against the wall for support. "What do you mean?" Holmes's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is only the beginning." The morning had not yet lifted its veil of mist, and the air in the house still carried a stagnant weight. Mrs. Carter led Holmes and Watson from the scene of Reginald Blythe's body, through a narrow hallway lined with paintings that seemed to stare down at them with unblinking eyes. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft sound of footsteps and the distant ticking of the clock upstairs, now more ominous than ever. As they entered the sitting room, Holmes's eyes scanned the room methodically, his sharp gaze sweeping over the furniture, the mantelpiece adorned with fragile trinkets, and the faint smell of dust that clung to the velvet cushions. It was a space that suggested comfort, but under the surface there was an unmistakable tension that even the lavish surroundings couldn't conceal. Seated in a chair near the fire, his posture stiff, was Edward Blythe, the late Reginald's cousin. Holmes's eyes immediately landed on him, taking in the man's sullen expression, his posture rigid as if his very body were trying to contain some great internal disturbance. Edward was a man of about 50, with a well-kept beard and sharp, calculating eyes that met Holmes's with a fleeting glance, before quickly turning away. "Edward Blythe," Holmes said, his voice calm, though there was a subtle edge to it. "I trust you have been informed of the discovery this morning?" Edward nodded curtly, his eyes now fixed on the fire, his fingers gripping the arm of the chair so tightly that the knuckles whitened. "Yes, Mr. Holmes," he replied, his voice low and strained. I was shocked to hear of Reginald's passing. We were close, but I didn't expect this." Holmes observed him carefully, noticing the hesitation in Edward's speech, the way he avoided eye contact. "Close?" Holmes repeated. "Would you say you were very close?" Edward stiffened but quickly recovered, his lips tightening in a thin line. "Not in the way you suggest. Reginald and I were family, but we had differences. Financial matters mostly. But nothing that would lead to this, surely." His tone was defensive, but Holmes could see the slight tremor in his voice, the tightening of his jaw. A moment of silence passed, and Mrs. Carter, standing by the door, cleared her throat. "Edward, I know it's difficult, but we mustn't avoid the subject," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "We have to understand why this happened. Why him?" Holmes glanced between the two of them, his mind already racing with connections, though he gave nothing away. "Tell me," he said softly, "what exactly were the differences you had with your cousin?" Edward shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tightening again around the armrests. Reginald was always reckless. He had schemes, ideas that didn't always sit well with the rest of the family. He'd often gamble or invest in things that were far too risky, and he wasn't shy about telling us when he stood to benefit. He paused, the words hanging heavy in the air. "But I never thought he would put us all in such danger." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on Edward, unwavering. There was something in his voice, something that didn't add up. The man's words were clipped, rehearsed almost, as if he were trying to control the story he was telling, but there were cracks in the delivery, a sense that he was hiding more than he let on. "Tell me," Holmes pressed, his voice suddenly more piercing, "how long has it been since you last saw your cousin?" Edward's face tensed and he shifted in his seat, a small nervous twitch in his brow. "A few days ago, just before the accident. He came by to speak with Lavinia and me about some business matters. I didn't think much of it, really. He was always coming by, talking about his latest ventures." "And what did he say about these ventures?" Holmes asked, his tone now laced with an intensity that made the air grow even thicker. Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her hands wringing the fabric of her skirt as she nervously glanced between the two men. "Reginald mentioned an inheritance, something about Albert's will. He was threatening to expose something. He wouldn't tell me exactly what, but it seemed serious." She paused, biting her lip as if debating whether to continue. "I thought it was just his usual talk, but now I wonder." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his attention fixed entirely on Mrs. Carter. "Expose something? What exactly did he threaten to reveal?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quivering slightly. "But whatever it was, it had to do with money, something that could ruin us, ruin this family." Edward scoffed quietly, the sound almost inaudible. "Nonsense," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Reginald was always one for dramatics. He had no reason to do anything of the sort. Money was never the issue. Holmes watched the exchange between them with keen interest, his mind piecing together fragments of the puzzle. There was a discrepancy in their statements, a subtle tension between their words, each one more carefully constructed than the last. He was interrupted by the sound of a faint knock at the door. A moment later, a servant entered the room, carrying a tray with a silver teapot and a single porcelain cup. The servant set the tray down on a nearby table, her movements slow, deliberate. She glanced at Holmes with a hint of hesitation, before turning her gaze toward Mrs. Carter. "A letter for you, madam," the servant said, her voice soft. Mrs. Carter took the letter, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. She read the contents quickly, her face paling as she did so. Holmes could see the moment her expression shifted, the slight widening of her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged. "What is it, Lavinia?" Edward asked, his voice sharp with concern. Mrs. Carter handed him the letter, her hand shaking as she did so. "It's from Reginald's lawyer, it seems. There's more to the will than we thought." Holmes stepped forward, intrigued. "Might I see it?" Mrs. Carter hesitated but nodded, handing him the letter. Holmes read through it quickly, his eyes scanning the words with practiced speed. The contents were simple yet troubling. Reginald Blythe had indeed made an unexpected revision to his will, one that would force the family to face certain truths they had long avoided. Holmes looked up from the letter, his gaze piercing through the room. "This changes things," he said quietly. "It seems the mystery surrounding Reginald Blythe's death is far more complicated than I anticipated." The day had progressed in slow, deliberate movements. Holmes, Watson and Mrs. Carter sat in the dimly lit drawing room, the silence of the house oppressive as they discussed the strange contents of Reginald Blythe's will. The heavy scent of polished wood filled the air, blending with the faint smoke of the fire crackling in the hearth. The heat from the flames provided little comfort, for Holmes felt the room's temperature drop with the growing tension. Mrs. Carter, her face pale and eyes shadowed with worry, had withdrawn into herself, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. Edward, too, was visibly agitated. He paced the length of the room, his boots scraping against the wooden floor with a rhythmic impatience, as if unable to escape his thoughts. Holmes, however, remained silent, his gaze distant. He was deep in thought, piecing together the disjointed fragments of the mystery that surrounded them. Something gnawed at him, a sensation that things were not as they appeared. It was Watson who broke the silence, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Holmes, do you believe the contents of that letter to be the true cause of Reginald's death?" Holmes turned toward him, his eyes narrowing. "It is difficult to say with certainty, Watson, but the timing is suspicious. If Reginald was indeed threatening to expose something, it could have provoked someone into silencing him." Mrs. Carter let out a small, bitter laugh, though it was devoid of any humor. "I don't know, Mr. Holmes. I never thought Reginald would go this far. He was always impulsive, but I never imagined him—" Her voice trailed off, and she fell silent again, her thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. Edward's pacing stopped abruptly, and he turned toward Holmes with a fierce expression. "I do not believe this is the work of some external force," he said, his tone tight, eyes dark with veiled emotion. "Reginald was—" Before he could finish, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. Mrs. Carter's eyes widened in alarm as she glanced toward the door. "What is it?" she asked, her voice strained. A servant appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with distress. "Madam, there has been another incident," she said, her words tumbling out in a rushed whisper. "Upstairs, in the attic." Holmes stood instantly, his hand brushing against his coat as he moved toward the door. "What has happened?" he demanded, his tone commanding. The servant's gaze dropped to the floor, and her voice trembled. "A body, sir. Another body." At the mention of another death, a heavy silence settled over the room. Edward's face went pale, and Mrs. Carter's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Holmes, however, remained unmoved, his mind already piecing together the implications of this new development. "Another body?" Watson echoed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Are you certain?" The servant nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes, sir, the body of a man. And there's something else, something strange. The laughter, it's still echoing through the house." Holmes's eyes flickered with renewed interest, the puzzle pieces clicking into place with disturbing clarity. "Lead the way," he instructed. Without another word, the servant hurried down the hall, Holmes, Watson and Edward following closely behind. The air grew colder as they ascended the stairs, the house feeling eerily alive with its secrets. Every step creaked underfoot, as if the very walls were whispering their hidden truths. The further they climbed, the more oppressive the silence became. The attic door stood slightly ajar when they arrived, and the servant pushed it open with a nervous glance at Holmes. The room beyond was a shadowy space, the light from the hallway just enough to reveal the dim outlines of old trunks and forgotten furniture. But it was not the clutter that caught their attention. It was the body, sprawled unnaturally across the floor, a grotesque mimicry of the first death. Holmes's eyes moved quickly over the scene. The body of a man older than Reginald lay on his back. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. But it was the smile, twisted and unnatural, that stood out. Just like the previous body, this man's face was frozen in an eerie grin, an expression that seemed entirely out of place in death. "Who is this?" Watson asked, stepping closer, his voice low. The servant stepped back, her face pale and hands wringing. "We believe it to be Mr. Albert Carter," she whispered. Holmes froze, his gaze locking on the body with new intensity. Albert Carter, Mrs. Carter's late husband, another member of the family, the same family that was now tied to two strange deaths. "Tell me," Holmes said, turning to Mrs. Carter, his tone firm but compassionate, "where is the rest of the family?" Mrs. Carter seemed to wilt under his gaze, her hands trembling as she slowly took a step forward. "Edward! Edward is my only family now, Mr. Holmes." Edward, who had been standing silently by the door, seemed to recoil at her words, his face hardening with a look of disdain. "Lavinia, you know I'm here," he muttered, his voice strained. But there was something in the way he said it, something that made Holmes' eyes narrow. Holmes crouched down beside the body, carefully inspecting the grin on Albert Carter's face. There was something disturbingly familiar about the expression. He glanced around the attic, taking in the surroundings. The dust, the forgotten memories, the worn furniture. The air felt heavier here, thicker with the weight of past lives, past secrets. "The laughter," Holmes muttered under his breath. "It's not just a noise, it's a message. But who is sending it?" The atmosphere in the attic was thick with an oppressive silence, the only sound being the faint crackling of the fire downstairs, which seemed impossibly distant. Holmes stood over the body of Albert Carter, his eyes darting from the twisted grin to the surroundings. The pungent smell of dust and stale air clung to the room, mixing with the faint scent of lavender that lingered from downstairs. The faint trace of cold on his skin was unsettling, as if the air in this house held something far worse than mere death. He rose slowly, his eyes scanning the room methodically. The walls, once adorned with delicate tapestries, had begun to fade under the weight of time. The attic, neglected and untouched, had been left to rot in solitude. There were old trunks, their lids slightly ajar, filled with forgotten relics, papers, half-burned books, and discarded clothing. But Holmes knew better than to be distracted by these objects. He needed to focus on what was here and now. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low, "look for anything unusual. We may be dealing with something more complex than a simple death." Watson nodded, his brow furrowed as he began searching through the cluttered space, his fingers brushing against dust-covered shelves and forgotten boxes. His face was a mask of concentration, though his eyes occasionally flicked back to Holmes, as if seeking reassurance. Holmes stepped closer to the body once more, his eyes narrowing as he examined the twisted smile on Albert Carter's face. The grin, grotesque and stretched beyond natural means, seemed to mock them, as if it held the answers to the mystery they sought, but would never reveal them. "It's as if the expression was frozen," Holmes muttered, almost to himself. His fingers brushed over the corpse's rigid features, careful not to disturb the scene. This wasn't an accidental death. The positioning of the body, the expression, it's too deliberate. Watson joined him, crouching beside the body with a quiet sigh. "It doesn't seem like a natural cause of death, Holmes. There's no sign of blood or obvious injury, just the unnatural expression." His voice was tinged with concern, though he trusted Holmes's deductions more than his own gut feelings. Holmes nodded, his eyes flickering over every detail. The clothes, though worn, were of fine quality, much like the garments of the other victim, Reginald Blythe. Both men had been wealthy, and yet their lives had ended in such cruel, macabre fashion. But there was something else, something he could not yet place his finger on. He slowly straightened up and turned to the room's surroundings. There was a faint imprint on the floor near the body. A footprint, half formed in the dust. It was subtle, easy to overlook, but Holmes's sharp eyes caught it immediately. A step too far to the left, as though someone had stood there recently and tried to conceal their presence. Watson followed his gaze, his expression hardening. "Do you think someone else was here?" Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he crouched, his fingers tracing the outline of the footprint. It was an odd angle, as if the person had come from behind the trunk and moved cautiously, careful not to leave any evidence. The footprint was faint, but it was unmistakable. Someone had been in the attic, and they had been here recently. He stood, his brow furrowed. Yes, someone else was indeed here, but why leave such a clue? It suggests they didn't anticipate being discovered. The hairs on the back of Watson's neck stood on end. Could it be one of the family? Mrs. Carter or Edward? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved towards the window, pulling aside the curtain slightly. The view outside was almost obscured by the fog, the streets below barely visible in the dense mist. He stared out for a moment, lost in thought, then turned back to Watson. I have my suspicions, but I need more. There is more to this room than meets the eye. Holmes's voice held a quiet intensity now, his earlier detachment replaced by something sharper, more urgent. Mrs. Carter, who had been standing in the doorway, watching in silence, stepped forward. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What are you saying, Mr. Holmes? Do you believe someone in my family did this?" Holmes paused, looking at her with a measured gaze. "I do not make assumptions without evidence, but the timing, the circumstances, they suggest this may not be the work of an outsider. Someone in this house knows more than they're letting on." Mrs. Carter's lips parted, but before she could respond, Edward appeared at the door, his eyes dark and guarded. His presence seemed to dominate the room, casting a shadow over the fragile tension. "What are you implying, Holmes?" he asked, his voice low and strained. Holmes did not flinch at the challenge in Edward's voice. Instead, he stepped toward him, his gaze unwavering. "I am implying that there is more to these deaths than meets the eye, Mr. Blythe, and you too may be hiding something." Edward's jaw clenched, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. "I have nothing to hide," Edward replied, his voice hard. "But I will not stand here and be accused without cause. What proof do you have?" Holmes's expression remained impassive. "The evidence, Mr. Blythe, is yet to be fully revealed, but rest assured I will find it." The tension between the two men was palpable. Mrs. Carter stood between them, her hands shaking, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She looked from her brother-in-law to Holmes, her mind racing. I don't know what to think any more," she whispered, her voice trembling. Holmes's expression softened slightly, though his focus remained sharp. "You must remain calm, Mrs. Carter. The truth, whatever it may be, will reveal itself in time." Watson stood back, watching the exchange carefully. He had seen Holmes in many situations, but there was something about this case that seemed to unsettle even the great detective. Perhaps it was the family's secrets, or perhaps it was the gruesome nature of the deaths. But Watson knew one thing: Holmes was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Holmes turned back to the body, his mind already running through possibilities. "We need to search the rest of the house, Watson. There's more here than just footprints and strange deaths." The house seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, its silence pressing down like an unseen weight. The events in the attic had shaken the family to their core, and the room where they now gathered felt as though it might collapse under the strain. Mrs. Carter sat in a chair near the fire, her face drawn with worry, while Edward stood by the window, his back rigid and unmoving. The tension between them was palpable, and Holmes could sense that neither had fully come to terms with the horror of the morning's discovery. Watson, ever the observer, stood by the door, his gaze darting from one person to the other. He had seen Holmes face many mysteries, but there was something in the air today that felt different, something elusive, something that didn't quite sit right. Holmes, with his usual calm, broke the silence. "Edward," he said, turning to the man standing by the window, "you mentioned earlier that you and Reginald had disagreements. Perhaps you would care to elaborate on those." Edward stiffened at the mention of his cousin, his fingers gripping the windowsill as if trying to hold onto some semblance of control. He turned slowly to face Holmes, his expression unreadable. "I've already told you everything there is to know," he said, his voice tight. "Reckless, he wasted money on foolish investments, gambling away more than he could afford. His actions almost ruined us all, and I was just trying to keep the family afloat." Holmes watched him closely, noting the underlying anger in Edward's voice, though his eyes betrayed no emotion. "And you felt justified in your frustration with him?" Holmes asked, his voice soft but probing. Edward's jaw tightened. "I didn't want to feel that way. But Reginald had no sense of responsibility. I tried to warn him. I was trying to protect what little we had left, but he wouldn't listen. He was obsessed with his own schemes, always pursuing the next grand idea without thinking of the consequences." Mrs. Carter, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice quiet but filled with an underlying sadness. "Reginald didn't deserve to die," she said, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "He was reckless, yes, but he was family, and I know he had his faults, but he never hurt anyone intentionally." She paused, as if searching for words. "I always tried to protect him, to keep him from making mistakes, but maybe I didn't do enough." Holmes's gaze softened slightly as he looked at her. "And yet, Mrs. Carter, it seems that Reginald's actions were not as isolated as you might have believed. The will he left behind is troubling. You mentioned he had threatened to expose something. What exactly was he referring to?" She hesitated, looking between Holmes and Edward. The weight of the question seemed to press down on her, and she struggled to find the right words. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Reginald never told me what it was, but he was insistent that it had to do with Albert's will and that it would affect everything." Holmes nodded, his expression still unreadable. "It seems, then, that Reginald had more enemies than you realized, Mrs. Carter. Perhaps one of these enemies wanted to stop him from revealing whatever secrets he had uncovered." At the mention of enemies, Edward's eyes flicked toward Holmes, and for a moment there was a flash of something sharp, something dangerous. "You seemed to be suggesting that I had a hand in this," he said, his voice low and cold. "I already told you I had no reason to harm Reginald. Yes, we had disagreements, but killing him? That's absurd." Holmes tilted his head slightly, studying Edward. "I am merely asking questions, Mr. Blythe. No assumptions have been made, only observations." There was a long, uncomfortable silence in the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth fighting against the chill in the air, but neither of them seemed to find any comfort in it. Edward's fingers, still gripping the windowsill, began to tremble ever so slightly, though he tried to hide it by clenching his hand into a fist. Holmes glanced at Watson, then back at Edward. "Tell me, Mr. Blythe, where were you last night?" The question seemed to hit Edward like a blow, and for the first time his facade of control cracked. His eyes shifted quickly to Mrs. Carter before returning to Holmes. "I was here," he said, his voice steady but forced. "I was with Lavinia. We were discussing some personal matters. There was no reason for me to leave the house." Holmes observed him carefully, then nodded slowly, as if considering the answer. "And you didn't hear anything unusual? No laughter, perhaps?" Edward's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Laughter? No, Mr. Holmes, I didn't hear any laughter. I was preoccupied with Lavinia's concerns. We were focused on other things." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind already turning over the new information. "Of course," he said, his tone smooth. "You see, Mr. Blythe, that is precisely what I find most curious, because I have spoken to the staff, and they tell me that laughter echoed through these halls last night, a strange, unsettling sound. Perhaps you can explain that?" Edward's lips curled into a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I can't explain it," he said quietly, "but perhaps it's the house itself. People claim it's haunted. The noise could have been anything." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on Edward, the tension between them palpable. "And yet, it seems that whatever it was, it's tied to the events unfolding here. Reginald's death, Albert's, and now this laughter. Mrs. Carter swallowed hard, her breath coming faster now. Is it possible that someone is trying to frighten us, to drive us mad with fear? Holmes didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stood from his chair, the movement swift and deliberate. I don't believe it's madness, Mrs. Carter. I believe it is the work of someone very methodical. Someone who has been planning this for some time. Edward's eyes narrowed, and his fingers tightened once more around the windowsill. And what, exactly, do you plan to do with your accusations, Holmes? Holmes turned toward him, his face unreadable. I plan to find the truth, Mr. Blythe, one piece at a time. The evening had descended with a thick, oppressive quiet, the once vibrant light of the day now swallowed by the heavy fog outside. The house felt colder, as though it too was waiting for something. Holmes sat in the same chair as before, but his posture had shifted. Less relaxed now, more tense, as if the weight of the mystery was finally beginning to press down on him. The room had grown smaller somehow, the walls drawing in, closing them off from the outside world. Mrs. Carter had excused herself earlier, retreating to her room, leaving Holmes and Watson alone with the evidence they had gathered thus far. But Holmes had yet to make sense of it all. Every piece of the puzzle felt incomplete, like a thread pulled too tightly, about to snap. Watson stood by the window, watching the fog roll in and obscure the view of the garden. His thoughts, like Holmes's, seemed caught between what had been revealed and what still lingered in the shadows. The image of Reginald Blythe's body, grinning and lifeless, was seared into his mind. But it was not just the grotesque nature of the death that disturbed him. It was the air of calculation that surrounded it. There was a method behind the madness, and that thought unsettled him more than the death itself. Holmes broke the silence. There are contradictions, Watson. Too many contradictions. Watson turned, his brow furrowed in confusion. Contradictions? What do you mean? Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the fireplace, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the arm of his chair. Consider the accounts we've heard. Mrs. Carter, for one, her behavior has been inconsistent. She's either deeply distressed, or she's withholding something. The way she hesitated when asked about Reginald's threats, the way she spoke of him, yet seemed relieved when we mentioned the will. Watson stepped closer, his face a mask of concern. You believe she knows more than she's letting on? Holmes didn't answer immediately, but his expression hardened as he thought it through. Yes, it's not just that she's withholding details. It's the emotional dissonance. She seems too calm at times, too erratic at others, as though she's playing a part, trying to appear as the grieving widow. There was a long pause as Watson processed the information, his mind working to fit the pieces together. And what of Edward? His behavior seems strange as well. Holmes nodded slowly. Indeed, Edward's reactions are equally telling. When I asked about the laughter, he was defensive, too defensive. He dismissed it quickly, almost too quickly. And his alibi, it's troubling. His claim that he was with Mrs. Carter all night, while she in turn says nothing about his whereabouts. Watson's gaze sharpened. So, you think Edward is lying? I don't think, Holmes replied. I know. His movements last night are far from clear. He claims to have been with his sister, yet we have no confirmation of that, and the laughter is too convenient a coincidence. A distraction? Distraction from what? Watson asked, his curiosity piqued. Holmes stood, pacing slowly in front of the fire, his eyes never leaving the flames. From the true nature of Reginald's death, there is more to this than familial squabbles and inheritance. Someone in this house is hiding something far more dangerous, and they're trying to keep us off the trail. Watson's eyes widened as the realization struck him. You mean someone is trying to cover up a deeper secret? But why? Holmes's gaze flicked to Watson. That, my friend, is what we must uncover. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Carter appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. She had clearly been crying, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking as she clutched a letter tightly to her chest. She stepped inside, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Holmes, I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been hiding the truth for far too long. It's time you know everything." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his interest piqued. "What do you mean, Mrs. Carter?" She stepped forward, the letter crumpled in her hands. "I kept silent because I was afraid, but now, with 2 deaths, I can no longer hide the truth. My husband, Albert, and Reginald, there was something they were involved in, something they tried to keep from the world." Holmes stepped closer, his voice calm yet intense. "Tell me, Mrs. Carter, what exactly were they involved in?" She swallowed hard, her gaze shifting from Holmes to Watson. "It wasn't just money, Mr. Holmes. There were deals, shady dealings. My husband and Reginald had become involved with people who were not to be trusted. They were making dangerous alliances, and Albert, he was blackmailing someone." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, each one more damning than the last. Watson's jaw clenched, but it was Holmes who broke the silence, his voice measured and precise. "Blackmail? Who were they blackmailing, Mrs. Carter?" She shook her head, her eyes filled with regret and fear. "I don't know, Mr. Holmes. I never knew who they were threatening. But Reginald, he told me he was going to expose it. That's why he made those changes to his will. That's why they had to silence him." Holmes's gaze darkened. "And Albert? Was he part of this plot?" Mrs. Carter's face twisted with guilt. "Yes, he was just as guilty. He was desperate, Mr. Holmes. Desperate to protect his reputation and his wealth. And now it's all unraveling." Holmes stood still, the weight of her confession pressing down on him. He turned to Watson, his mind racing through the new information. "It seems, Watson, we have uncovered the real motive." Watson met his gaze. "The question now, Holmes, is who in this house will go to any lengths to protect that secret?" Holmes's lips pressed together, his eyes cold as he answered, "We are about to find out." Holmes sat at the edge of the desk, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the room. The fire in the hearth had long since died down to embers, but the air still held a faint chill. The silence was thick, oppressive, almost suffocating, and Holmes allowed the weight of the case to settle on him, his mind racing through the latest developments. Watson sat across from him, his face reflecting the same contemplative mood that had taken hold of Holmes. The confession from Mrs. Carter had altered the course of the investigation, revealing a web of deceit and blackmail that reached far deeper than they had initially suspected. The revelation of Albert and Reginald's involvement with dangerous individuals and their use of blackmail had given Holmes the missing pieces he had been searching for. But even now, as he sat before the evidence, something gnawed at him. There were still too many unanswered questions. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" Watson asked, breaking the stillness. His voice was quiet, careful, as though he sensed the weight of the moment. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the papers spread out before him. Notes from the interviews, observations from the crime scenes, the torn letter from Reginald Blythe's hand. His mind was a whirlwind of connections, but he needed to ground himself in the fact. "The key," Holmes murmured, "is not in the blackmail itself, Watson. That's a means to an end, but it's the reason behind the blackmail that matters. Someone wanted to hide something so damning that Reginald Blythe was willing to risk everything to expose it." Watson leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "But who, Holmes? Who was Reginald threatening to expose?" Holmes's fingers drummed lightly on the table, the rhythmic tapping a faint echo in the still room. His thoughts were already moving ahead, drawing conclusions with precision. "It's not just a matter of money or reputation, Watson. There is something more sinister here. Reginald wasn't just going to reveal a financial scandal. He was going to expose a network of corruption, something that, if brought to light, could ruin powerful people." He stood suddenly, his energy shifting from contemplation to action. The movement was fluid, purposeful, as if he had already begun to piece the puzzle together in his mind. "The laughter, Watson. That's what connects it all." "The laughter?" Watson echoed, his confusion apparent. "But what does that have to do with the blackmail?" Holmes turned to face him, his eyes gleaming with a rare intensity. "It's a symbol, Watson. A message from the killer. Whoever was behind Reginald's death wanted to ensure that the message wasn't lost. They wanted to frighten the family, confuse the investigators. It wasn't just a random noise. It was deliberate. A way to distract us from the real motive." Holmes paused, his mind now fully engaged with the theory he was constructing. The timing of the deaths, the expression on the victims' faces. They were orchestrated. Reginald's death was no accident, nor was Albert's. The killer knew exactly what they were doing. Watson stood, pacing alongside Holmes, his hands clasped behind his back. "So, you're saying that someone in this house is responsible? Someone who has been hiding behind these lies?" Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "Yes, the killer is not an outsider. This is someone who has been inside the family, someone who has had access to everything, who has been living with these secrets for far too long." He paused, then turned to Watson, his face a mask of quiet determination. "There's more to this house than just family connections, Watson. These people are linked by a shared past, one filled with betrayal, fear, and greed, and that past is finally catching up with them." Watson looked at Holmes, his mind still trying to catch up with the revelation. But why? Why would someone go this far to protect a secret? What's so important that they'd be willing to kill to keep it hidden? Holmes stepped closer to the window, gazing out at the fog that continued to shroud the world outside. "I believe the answer lies in the will. Reginald was more than just a cousin to the Carter family. He was the key to unlocking everything. The will he altered before his death, it wasn't just about money, it was about control." Watson's expression shifted, and he nodded slowly, understanding dawning on him. "Control of what?" "Of everything," Holmes said, his voice cold and clear. "Of the power and influence that this family holds. Reginald's plan was to expose the corruption that ran deeper than anyone realized, to reveal the true nature of the alliances his relatives had made, alliances that could have destroyed them if the wrong people found out." Holmes turned back to Watson, his eyes locked onto his companion's. "Someone in this house feared that Reginald's revelation would tear their world apart, and that fear, Watson, led them to kill." Watson took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his chin as he processed the information. "So it's not just about money, it's about power, and the killer is someone who couldn't let that truth see the light of day." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Exactly. Now, we must determine who among them had the most to lose, who stood to lose everything if Reginald's revelations came to light." As the words left Holmes's lips, a chilling realization struck both men at once. The one person in the family who stood to lose the most, the one who had the most to gain from keeping the past buried, was the one who had been the most desperate to protect the family's legacy. The house was silent, its oppressive stillness broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. Holmes stood in the center of the drawing room, his mind sharply focused on the web of lies and secrets that had entangled the Carter family. Watson stood to his right, his eyes darting between the various figures gathered in the room: Edward Blythe, Mrs. Carter, and the household staff. The tension in the air was palpable, thick as the fog that had yet to lift from the streets outside. Holmes's gaze swept over the room, his expression unreadable. He knew what had to be done, knew that the time for questioning had passed. The pieces had all fallen into place, and now it was time to unveil the truth. "I believe it's time," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room stiffen. "The killer is among us." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Mrs. Carter's breath caught in her throat, and Edward's jaw clenched. The household staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was to come. But it was Edward who spoke first, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "You're wasting your time, Holmes," Edward said, his eyes flashing. "There's no killer here but the one who haunts your mind. You've spent too long chasing ghosts and shadows." Holmes's eyes narrowed and he took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Edward's. "Perhaps, Mr. Blythe, you're more familiar with ghosts than you would like to admit, but no, I'm not chasing shadows. The killer is very real, and they've been hiding in plain sight." Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her face pale and drawn. "What are you saying, Mr. Holmes? Are you accusing Edward?" Holmes didn't answer immediately, but his silence was enough to send a shiver through the room. The tension thickened as Holmes turned to face Mrs. Carter, his expression cold but resolute. "I'm not accusing anyone yet, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice calm but steady. "But I am pointing out the facts. Your late husband, Albert, and Reginald Blythe were involved in something far more dangerous than mere financial troubles. They were part of a scheme that went deeper than anyone could have imagined." Mrs. Carter's breath caught in her throat, and she looked away, unable to meet Holmes's gaze. Edward, too, seemed unsettled by the revelation, his eyes narrowing as Holmes continued. Reginald's attempt to expose these dealings, his attempt to reveal the truth behind the blackmail, was the catalyst for his death. But Reginald was not alone. Albert knew too much, and when he too was found dead, his smile, his expression, was a message, a warning. Edward clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening. "Enough of this nonsense. You're making accusations based on assumptions. No one here is guilty." Holmes's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Assumptions, Mr. Blythe? I think not. I've gathered enough evidence to know exactly who is responsible. You were there, Mr. Blythe, when Reginald was killed. You had the most to lose from his revelations." Edward's eyes flickered briefly before he spoke again, his voice strained. "You have no proof, Holmes, just wild conjecture. You can't possibly know what you're talking about." Holmes stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a sudden storm. "But I do, Mr. Blythe. I know that the laughter you claim to dismiss as a haunting was no such thing. It was a signal, a way to draw attention away from what truly mattered. It was meant to confuse, to make us look elsewhere. But the truth is clear." He turned to face Mrs. Carter, his gaze softening slightly, though the steel of his resolve never wavered. "Mrs. Carter, you were the one who kept the secrets. You were the one who hid the truth about Albert's blackmail. You were the one who feared what Reginald might reveal. You couldn't let it come to light." Mrs. Carter gasped, her hands trembling as she took a step back, as if trying to distance herself from the accusation. No, I didn't." Holmes raised a hand, silencing her. "You didn't know, Mrs. Carter. You didn't know what your late husband was involved in. You knew, as did Edward, you both knew. But it wasn't just about protecting your family's wealth. It was about protecting yourselves from a truth far more damning." Edward stepped forward, his expression darkening with rage. "You've no right to accuse us of such things, Holmes. You have no proof." Holmes held up the torn letter that had once been in Reginald's hand, the one he had clutched in death, the letter that had never been fully examined until now. "This letter, Mr. Blythe, was to be your undoing. Reginald was going to expose your secret. The letter contained the name of the person he was blackmailing, and it's your name, Edward. You couldn't afford to let him speak." A gasp echoed through the room as Mrs. Carter's face went ashen. "Edward? But—" Holmes turned back to her, his voice unwavering. Reginald knew too much. He was going to reveal everything, including the identity of those who had been blackmailed. Edward's desperation to keep that secret led him to murder. Edward's face twisted in fury, but it was clear now. His mask had cracked. "You don't know what you're saying, Holmes. I didn't kill him. I didn't." Holmes's voice was cold as ice. "But you were there, Mr. Blythe. You were the one who needed to stop him. And now we have the evidence to prove it." The room had fallen into a stunned silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the remaining embers in the fireplace. The tension that had gripped the air now hung heavy, like the last breath before a storm's fury. Edward stood motionless, his face a mask of barely contained rage, but his hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying the truth that lay beneath the surface. Mrs. Carter, her face pale and drawn, had not spoken since Holmes' revelation. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, her hands clutching the folds of her dress as if trying to hold herself together. Holmes stood tall, his gaze unwavering as he looked at the two of them, his mind already moving beyond the confrontation. It was over now. The truth had been laid bare, and the tangled web of deceit had finally been severed. Edward, his voice hoarse and thick with anger, broke the silence. "You have no right, Holmes. You have no proof. This is all just speculation." Holmes's eyes remained steady, cold, unyielding. "Speculation, Mr. Blythe? No. This is deduction. Reginald's death was not just a tragedy. It was a calculated move. You and your family were determined to protect yourselves, even if it meant going to the extreme. Reginald was silenced, and so was Albert, but their secrets were never meant to stay hidden for long." There was a long pause, the weight of Holmes's words sinking in. Watson, who had been standing by quietly, looked at the two of them with an air of finality. "The truth has a way of coming out, whether we want it to or not," he said softly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that Holmes had long admired in him. Edward's expression shifted, if only for a moment, his facade of anger crumbling. His eyes flickered between Holmes and Mrs. Carter, and there was a brief flicker of uncertainty, of something far deeper than rage or denial. He seemed to hesitate, as though torn between his own guilt and the consequences of the truth that now lay in the open. I didn't mean to go this far," Edward muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "But Reginald, he wouldn't listen. He was reckless, and I couldn't let him ruin everything. He knew things that would destroy us." Mrs. Carter finally lifted her gaze, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with unshed tears. "You killed him, Edward," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You killed Reginald for money, for your own greed. But we're all going to suffer for it now. We're all going to pay." Edward's jaw clenched, and for a moment he looked as though he might argue, might try to defend himself, but the weight of the truth, of Mrs. Carter's accusation, seemed to drain the last of his resolve. He lowered his gaze to the floor, his shoulders sagging, as if the weight of his own guilt had become too much to bear. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Your actions have consequences, Mr. Blythe, and now the law will see to them. You will answer for your crimes." Edward said nothing. There was nothing more to say. His fate had already been sealed. Mrs. Carter, still trembling, slowly sank into a nearby chair. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What happens to us?" Holmes's expression softened, though there was no compassion in his voice, only the quiet finality of someone who had seen the destructive power of secrets too many times. "The law will take its course. You will both have to face the consequences of your actions." He paused, his eyes lingering on her, and then he turned to Watson. "The truth has been uncovered, Watson, and now there is nothing left but the aftermath." The room seemed to grow colder, as if the very air itself was mourning the events that had unfolded within these walls. Mrs. Carter, her shoulders trembling, looked up at Holmes one final time, her face a mixture of grief and something far darker, regret perhaps, or the hollow ache of a life that could never be repaired. As Holmes and Watson made their way toward the door, Watson turned to look back at the house. The fog had begun to lift outside, though it remained thick and stubborn, as though clinging to the memories of the tragedy that had occurred within. He sighed, a quiet, almost inaudible sound. "The truth always finds its way out, doesn't it, Holmes?" Watson said softly, more to himself than to his companion. Holmes glanced at him, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if contemplating something far beyond the present moment. "Yes, Watson, but it is often the truth that leaves the greatest scars." With that, Holmes turned toward the door and stepped out into the fog, Watson following close behind. The case was over, but the echoes of the events in the Carter house would linger long after they had departed, like the faintest trace of laughter that could never quite be forgotten.